So the first framework is, and these are just in alphabetical order, nothing is necessarily more important than other. Authority is constructed and contextual. So information resources reflect their creators' expertise and their credibility. They're evaluated based on the information need and the context in which information will be used. Authority is constructed in that various communities may recognize different types of authority, and it's contextual in that the information need may help determine the level of authority required. So when we're talking to our students in the library about this, they come to us and they say, oh, I have this paper due and I need a scholarly source, and what does that mean? And that's a big question. You're nodding that, yes, you probably get that question a lot too. As academics, as people who do research, I think we understand instinctively about authority. You know, we understand what an authoritative source is, we understand the level of education that goes into somebody becoming an authoritative source. But our students don't always know that. You know, they are just like, oh, I found it on the internet and that website looked good. There weren't any pop-ups, so hey, I'm good to go. So that's one of the things, the threshold concepts that we want to get them past when we're talking about authority. Also, what kind of authority do they need? One thing that I kind of cover with my students is that it's on a spectrum, and you go all the way from scholarly research that's, you know, the Journal of the American Medical Association or things like that, all the way to a blog post that who knows who wrote that. And where they need to find information can fall on that spectrum somewhere. It's not, they don't need an authoritative source to find out what's the sixth planet from the sun, right? A textbook is authoritative enough, or even most websites probably are going to get it right. But for something about what is the makeup of that planet, you know, what is the atmosphere like? What would it be like for somebody to live there? You want something that's moving a little more authoritative. So that's one of the things that we try to get through with students there. The next frame that I am not clicking to for some reason. There we go. Information creation is a process. So information in any format is produced to convey a message and is shared via a selected delivery method. The iterative process of researching, creating, revising, and disseminating information vary, and the resulting product reflects these differences. So when you get published, you know that there's a lengthy process of getting into a scholarly peer-reviewed journal. But I don't know how much our students understand about what that process is. You know, they think, oh, I can go online and I can type this up and I can put it up on a website. And that's true, they could, but the process of getting that vetted, I think, is where they get a little bit tied up. So I think they also feel like, oh, I should be able to go find a website that's going to give me all the answers, and then I'm just going to be able to write my paper and it's going to be great the first time, without thinking about the revisions, without thinking about, oh, well, I read something else and that informs my decision-making process a little bit differently. So when we talk about the process of information creation, that's what we're trying to get across to them there. Information has value. Information possesses several dimensions of value, including as a commodity, as a means of education, as a means to influence, and as a means of negotiating and understanding the world. Legal and socioeconomic interests influence information production and dissemination. We're actually going, after we go over the 6 frameworks, this is the one we're going to spend some time talking about. So I'm just going to breeze past this one for a moment, and we'll talk about that one in more depth. Research is inquiry. Research is iterative and depends upon asking increasingly complex or new questions, whose answers in turn develop additional questions or lines of inquiry in any field. I think this one is, you know, we go into higher education and we go into research and we love this. I think that all of us feel that curiosity and that excitement about finding something new or thinking about things in a different way. I think our students sometimes don't know how to get to that point. So research as inquiry is letting them know that you're not necessarily going to find the right answer the first time. You're not necessarily going to find a solid answer ever. You know, there are competing thoughts on things and how to kind of evaluate that information to come up with the best results. And scholarship is a conversation. Communities of scholars, researchers, or professionals engage in sustained discourse with new insights and discoveries occurring over time as a result of varied perspectives and interpretations. I think this is my favorite one. So whenever we write papers, whenever we go to conferences, if we create posters or visit a poster session at a conference, even when we're having workshops with our colleagues, we're having a conversation about things. And that one I think is hard to get across. We think of conversation as just you and I are going to sit here and talk about things, but of course people can talk about things without ever saying two words to each other, right? So we want students to understand that this research is published, and then somebody says, I wonder if that's true for this different population, or I wonder if that's true for this different intervention. And they go on to the next, they base their research on that, and it keeps building and building. And then finally, searching as strategic exploration. So searching for information is often nonlinear and iterative, requiring the evaluation of a range of information sources and the mental flexibility to pursue alternate avenues as new understanding develops. So, did anybody ever give up eggs because of the cholesterol or low fat, go to low fat dairy and things? I always think about these when I'm thinking about the strategic exploration. It's like, oh, that answer wasn't final, was it? So with this idea of search as strategic exploration, we try to get students to understand that an answer isn't necessarily the final answer. We may beat a dead horse if we go too far, but there are always ways to kind of go here and there with our searching. Are there any questions? I'm going to pause real quick and see if we have any chat questions, or do y'all have any questions about the frameworks?
On the handout, we included some questions to ask and help you understand each one, kind of bring up more points. And we also added some of the information literate abilities that we hope the students would get from each point. Those are the kinds of things that as librarians we can assist with and partner with the faculty to help the students get to these points.
And with each of these frames, we're thinking about ways that we can map that to the curriculum for a particular topic. So not just information literacy in general, but somebody who is studying to become a pharmacist, what are some gateways that they have to pass through? These are threshold concepts that they have to pass through to understand and become the professionals that we're trying to help them become. And these are basic information literacy sometimes, but also advanced. And so we really try to work with our faculty to map that with your curriculum and get that to where we're all on board on the same page for that.
And specific to the subject.
Yes. Okay. So as we move on, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to spend the rest of our time talking a little bit about information has value. I think, again, as researchers and as academics, we know this, whether it's because we might make more money because of our publications, or something that we work on is eventually going to be out in the marketplace. We kind of understand this, that our students a lot of times have trouble, especially our lower division students who haven't necessarily participated in research yet, who haven't necessarily thought about how something gets from an idea in a laboratory out to a medication that they need. So how does the flu vaccine actually work or not work? So we have a couple of questions for you. So the first one is, what does information have value mean to you? And I am going to make sure everybody is unmuted from my end. So if you have something to add, out there. We'd really love to hear from you. But so, what does that mean to you?
Well, I guess to me it's sort of a justification for the existence of the university.
Definitely.
That's basically why we're here.
Mhm.
And I guess it's especially relevant today because there's so much low quality information out there these days, and people don't seem to know the first thing about how to sort through what's reliable and what isn't.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
An easy way to answer that is that, and I try to explain this to my students, part of their fees go to the library to pay for databases, to pay for the more valuable sources of information that people have invested their careers in building, and there are sort of gateways to that. That's like, it's a special thing. It's a privilege that you get to access this information because not everyone can. Yes. And the same with the books in the library, obviously. But I mostly teach online, so it's usually the online sources.
Yes.
We use.
Those databases are usually called the hidden internet because you have to have the key to get to them,
Mhm.
which is unfortunately the cost of
Mhm.
it. And I think you're right in that right now there seems to be a battle going on about what is good information, what is not bad
Mhm.
information. We see it all the time in the news, but we're seeing it a lot going on, and I think it can be very confusing for the students trying to filter through all of that.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've had the really unpleasant experience of giving my lab students an assignment to just write a paper about any scientific topic of interest within a certain range of topics, and then give a presentation on it for the class. And I unfortunately was not careful enough about checking into, their information sources and that sort of thing. And the stuff that I was hearing in those presentations was just, I just couldn't believe it. It was like really bizarre stuff, like government conspiracies and tiny stickers that shield you from electromagnetic radiation. And it's like,
Well, we need some of those.
yeah,
Right?
this one girl was trying to sell these little stickers that you could put on like cell phones and computers and everything to shield yourself from the radiation from those things. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, I really, really should have looked into this, because I had just assumed the students would know better than to buy into that sort of thing. And it's just, oh geez, it was just shocking.
Definitely. What about anybody on Zoom want to have an answer to that?
It just made me think of fake news. Information has value, but not always is information valuable. Because, I guess it's valuable, but sometimes it's not real. And so, we base our decisions on the information that we have and that we get. And, part of teaching our students to do literature reviews is to look at that information that is value and to, throw away all of the excess that's not. And so just in my head, I'm thinking about, how does the library, work with students specifically, and you can come back to that, to help with this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And we can definitely come back to that. I think that's very important what you're saying about, you think that, oh, nobody really believes that. I remember when I was younger, like the National Enquirer, you just were like, ha ha ha, that's, sitting there to entertain you while you're standing in line at the grocery store. And now it's like the National Enquirer everywhere on the internet, or worse. and people don't know that it's like, maybe not the best thing. So, well, that brings us to our next question, which is coming up. What what do you think information has value means to your students?
They want a grade, and information adds value to their own opinions in a paper to help them get that grade.
Mhm.
It's a very basic kind of, I teach freshman comp and junior level writing classes and graduate classes, and so that's much more on the freshman
Mhm.
side.
Yeah, when I was in grad school, I substituted at the public library and always had high school students coming in saying, I wrote this paper and I need a source for it. And I'm like, how do you write a paper if you didn't have a source on
Now I
it?
just need some quotes.
Yeah, I just need some quotes there.
Ugh.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to pretend that I can read my students' minds or anything, but I strongly suspect that probably the only reason they value information is as a way of gaining credentials to get a high-paying job,
Mhm.
basically.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when you're teaching people who, students who major in things like engineering and the sciences and that sort of thing, more professionally oriented fields. You tend to doubt that they're just there to become enlightened. It's really more about being able to survive in a tough economy
Mhm.
by gaining the technical skills or whatever that people will be willing to pay you handsomely for.
Definitely. And I think that's part of this idea of information has value that we don't necessarily focus on all the time, but it's true. It's a commodity. The information and things that you're learning are a commodity, or you can commodify them. So I think that's good insight.
I think for my students, it's about being relative. If it's not relative to them, if they can't see the application, then it doesn't mean a whole lot. I'm just thinking about the lecture that I'm doing this week, and it means something to me. It's somewhat about the history of education and how that applies towards, constructionism and constructivism, and we're eventually moving towards innovative thinking. But I'm wondering in my head, and I've thought about it all week, how much of that are they actually going to suck in, and how much of that is really important to them, because some of it's history, and it may not be as relative. And so I think we have to find ways that there's an application there. And like you said, for a job in the future, or, is it going to help them in this class for their grade? If it's not, and they don't see that, then I think they just kind of don't pay attention.
Mhm. I think we all have a pretty good filter like that, like, oh, that's not relevant to me, so I don't need to pay attention to it. I definitely think that's very insightful. So going back. So we have a video, and here in the room, we've passed out what the questions are on the video. This was put together from Bucknell University Library, and they are talking to an associate professor of global strategy and ethics about some of these information questions about information having value. And I'm going to go ahead and pop that up.
It's not very long. So
Yeah, it's not very long, and we're going to stop it in between the questions to talk a little bit about each of the questions, because I think there's some good discussion to be had around those. And it touches a little bit on some of the things that y'all mentioned as well. And it's my biggest nightmare.
We tested this twice.
I know how that works.
We tested ourselves right out of it working.
Maybe make it slow again. I can't believe that. Okay, we're going to do it in interpretive dance.
Okay, there he is again. Let's try again.
natural starting place for thinking about the value of information and knowledge, especially for a business strategist, would seem to be that we would talk about knowledge and information having a market value, right? That intellectual property is something that somebody creates and therefore should be able to get the benefits of it in the marketplace. That's how a business strategist, I think, is supposed to start the answer. But the reality is my starting point is a little bit different. I like the notion that knowledge has intrinsic value. I think people get into scholarship as a faculty member studying, whether they study poetry or chemistry or business strategy, they do that to understand it deep down because they believe that it has value in and of itself. It's intrinsic. And I think, to me, academic responsibility flows not out of considerations that I have in the back of my head that I might be depriving somebody of their property, but just because I love knowledge and learning so much, and that's why I pursue it. And it would be anathema for me to consider being irresponsible in sourcing and plagiarizing. If you love painting, it would be silly to cut and paste something off of the internet and try to use that and pass it off as your own. No great painter would ever do that. And just in that same way, I would say people who are committed to the intrinsic value of learning, who love learning for learning's sake, would just find it anathema to actually want to borrow somebody else's ideas and call them their own. Why would you do that?
I'm sorry, I just got your message, Julie. I'm going to cut and paste the link to the video in the chat real quick for you.
Yeah, we could hear it. We just couldn't see the
Okay.
image. We still listen to it.
Okay, well, that's good. So what do you think about that? What do you think about the value of information contributing to an understanding about academic responsibility?
Well, I mean, what he said makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you are, I mean, if you consider information to be intrinsically valuable, then you wouldn't be producing anything of value by borrowing somebody else's stuff and pretending that it's yours. So that would be more of a use of information as a means to an end, like, you know, to get a grade or to get a degree or to get a high-paying job, that sort of thing. And I guess whenever you go overboard using things as a means to an end, that's when unethical behavior starts to crop up.
Yes.
We have lots of conversations about academic responsibility when we teach freshman composition, because we're some of the first line of instruction about like how, you know, responsible ways to use it. And I think over the past few years, we've moved away from the property approach to it because it assumes nefarious motivations on the part of students who like go and steal something in order to accomplish. Most of it, especially when you're talking about freshmen, they really don't understand how all this works. And so that's why something like this is really valuable to go through. And more often, I've helped mediate lots of plagiarism cases. At UT Austin, I was a grad student and here with my own students. They sometimes, like, they know what they're doing is not right, but they want to pass the paper and they know they didn't budget enough time for it. But I think if we can really lead them through steps to understand how some information has more value than others, and talking about the key to the databases and things like that, thinking about how people's experience and expertise helps craft more valuable information for us to understand something. I think that process, which takes time out of like whatever else you're trying to teach, it can help prevent some of the things that we see as abuses or theft, and doesn't criminalize what they're doing. It's just more based on misunderstanding. On the students level, at our level, it's a different story.
Yes. I think we can all agree with that. Definitely. How about Zoom? Anybody? I know that one's pretty straightforward for us, I think. So the next question that's going to come up.
So I grew up in a working class neighborhood, mainly of shell fishermen, and I went to the public library. And that's where I got my start as a scholar, as somebody who was interested in the world. Every piece of information I had was whatever I could get at a public library. And public libraries, in a lot of ways, exist in our democracy to eliminate, to the degree that you can, the privilege that comes from a sort of privileged access to information based on class or race or ethnicity or background. As I've grown as a scholar and as I've entered the marketplace for academic ideas and as I've worked in the business world, I've seen that the information I had access to in that public library was nothing. It paled in comparison to the types of information that companies have at their disposal, the types of information that scholars have at their disposal, the tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars we spend on databases to give faculty and students at a university access to information. It's an enormous privilege that we have, but that puts a responsibility on us to remember that there are people who are still trying to get information through public access, that there still are people who are trying to make good decisions as citizens or investors or as thinkers engaged in our society or as parents on the safety of products based only on what they have access to in terms of information in their public library or in the free or on the internet. So I think it puts a really heavy responsibility on us to think about information privilege and the effects that it has and the ways that we can circumvent it.
Thoughts about information privilege. I know earlier when we were talking a little bit about it, you mentioned databases and how we have access to those and you know, the cost that comes along with that.
I think, you know, our students are very privileged in that they have access to so much information. But a lot of times I find even my graduate level students, when I'm, you know, doing an independent study and I'm working with them on just one-on-one on writing and doing literature reviews, I don't know. I don't know if they're taking the easy way out, you know, because a lot of times they will find things, plagiarize things. Most of the time they just pull things off of the internet. And I don't think they really use the resources that are available to them. And I don't know if that's because they don't really understand how to use them or that they just choose to do what's easy.
I think that choosing to do what's easy is frequently a culprit there. You know, in the library, in Librarylandia at large, we're always trying to figure out ways to make information more accessible, make our databases easier to use. How do we teach students how to do this so that it's easy for them? So I think that does speak a little bit to that too.
It's one of the hardest things, I think, in the library because I manage the databases and there is no standardization with all of the different vendors and all of the different providers. There is no standardization from one to the other to the other. They all search, but they all search differently and they all have different filters and they all have different different ways to search. It can be very overwhelming and very confusing, and we try real hard to list them alphabetically, then list them by subject, and group them on the research guides so that they're very to kind of take some of the guesswork out of it, and to also then provide classes when we're invited into the classes to take more of the guesswork out of it. But it is a never-ending process for us, and it is a really huge issue for a lot of students. So I always think it's a combination of this is easier to do if I just take this. And it's also then a little bit of a problem with, I don't get this, I don't understand, and not taking that next step, well, I'm just going to call the library and someone there's going to walk me through it, because we're open and ready to do that all the time. And I think once you get them started on this, they just fly, they're really good and they appreciate it and love it. But sometimes it is a little overwhelming for them. Sometimes it's a little overwhelming for us. How many databases can we get, and learning all of them so that we can help anybody who walks in to any certain degree. So it's very interesting, but it can be very difficult, especially for the younger students.
And that makes me think of two things. Well, just the value of students' time, and how much it costs to really be able to use all of this privilege and this access. Because it gets better every year, I imagine, but some of our students don't have computers at home, or they don't have reliable internet on the ranch where they live. And they also, their time is valuable because so many of our students work and have families, and that's undergrads and graduate students. And so if they've tried and they follow the directions and they pay attention to the library presentation, but they spent 2 hours just trying to find something, and they I can see how they would say, I can't do it the right way, but I have to turn it in, and I've spent all the time I meant to spend on this phase of research. I'm just trying to make it work, but I can't.
Yes.
So yeah, I understand that pressure, and the how what I experience and the privileges that I have, they might make these other difficulties not easy for me to see.
Mm-hmm. I think that's definitely true. We were talking about people not having internet access or not having computers. My computer died over Christmas break, and I haven't had the chance to get a new one. And I had to go to my public library over the weekend to print something, and it was just like, wow, like if I
all the time,
right, and you work, and I live in a small community, so my public library isn't open very late, and by the time I get off of work and go pick up my kid and can get there, it's like I have 15 minutes to be able to get to what I want and be able to print it out. So I think that's definitely a good point, that sometimes we really take for granted how easy we have it when we can do that at home. And that's why the library's open until 2 a.m. So I had to plug that a little bit.
Is that every day?
It's Sunday through Thursday.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I forgot that happened.
Yeah.
They still want it open 24 hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
If they would just give us more room.
Yeah. Zoom, anybody else out there want to add to that? Doing okay? Well, let's move on to the next one.
The difference between a producer and a consumer of knowledge is one click. When you're online and you're consuming a blog post, for example, or you're reading a website or a news story on a news source, and you decide to respond with a comment and click, suddenly you go from being a consumer to a producer. We've spent a lot of time in our lives thinking about the difference in the days when print media was difficult to do, right? When publishing a book or getting published in a newspaper or publishing a letter to the editor in a magazine, there was a huge difference between being a producer of knowledge and a consumer. And sometimes I think it's really helpful for students to remember back to those days, to see that there is a difference between the responsibilities that are placed on somebody who's simply reading information and consuming that information, and somebody who's contributing to the marketplace of ideas.
So I have a lot of thoughts on that one, but I want to hear from you first. Do you have your students, beyond just like a paper, creating multimedia things?
I think a lot about audience because they teach rhetoric and writing and persuasion, and I do some things very well, but I haven't had my students produce text for other audiences beyond the class. And I know that some people value, I mean, that's just another option for ways to teach.
You don't have enough to do.
Yeah. But we do ask them to think about audience and to think about your own, we call it ethos or credibility, as someone who will produce information for an audience, you know, or is doing that already. You know, social media, you're consuming and producing messages. What was the question again?
It's
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Why is it important for students to consider their roles as both contributors and consumers in the information market?
And as much as I hate that we have to have a term for it, the term fake news maybe makes it easier for them to understand some information is more valuable than others, like we've been saying. And if they want to be respected and they want to not hopefully thinking beyond just winning a debate on Facebook or something, but that counts too. That it's better in the long run, it's better for everyone's information literacy if they consider their sources and, you know, do some research before popping off on a Facebook thread or a response to a news story.
And it really is, I mean, it's not even enough to, you know, have reliable sources and everything like that if you can't communicate your ideas clearly. And the students, you know, they seem to have some trouble clearly expressing themselves, at least in my field. You know, I sometimes read what they've written and I just have no idea what's going on in their minds. It's like, I guess they just don't understand how difficult it is to make somebody else understand. So they're not putting the necessary effort into making themselves clear because they think it's going to be, you know, they think that it's going to be easy to understand what they're saying, basically. And so it's not necessarily that they're lazy, they just don't understand how much work they have to put into clarifying their statements, basically.
Definitely. I think it's something that we're frequently very keenly aware of is, are they going to get what I'm saying? Because I know we do that when we're trying to do instruction is, you know, I know what I'm saying, but am I using lingo or am I assuming pre-knowledge that they won't get? And sometimes I think they think in terms of, oh, well, everybody's going to get the joke or, you know, the reference that they're making. And it's like, I have no idea what you're talking about at all.
I think because we've been involved in knowledge creation and the community of scholars, it's much more natural, maybe not natural, but learned for us to say to a colleague, hey, can you put your eyes on this before I send this email, or, you know, working with a writing group or collaborator writing some piece of scholarship. Do you get what I'm saying, or do I need to revise it in a way that other people who are not in my head will understand what I'm trying to say? And so teaching that to students can be a lifelong skill of understanding, like, you have to make a leap between your head and someone else's eyes to know that the way you're saying it is not clear to everyone, and so at least get one other person to look at it before you know, click send or publish, whatever.
We go through that even in the library.
Oh yeah.
How much of this is library speak that
Yes.
we understand, but the students are not, even the faculty will not.
Yeah.
I think I was really very young when I realized everybody doesn't think the same way as I do. So when you say something that person doesn't understand, I would sit there and say, why don't they understand? I make perfect sense.
Yeah.
But it's just different process. And so it's very difficult.
When I was in grad school, I would ask my mom to proofread papers. And my mom, she does not like to write papers. She's not a writing person. And she'd be like, but I'm not going to know what you're talking about. I'm like, that's why I want you to read it.
Yeah.
Because if it makes sense to you, then I'm making sense.
Yeah.
Because you don't have the pre-knowledge about what I'm talking about. So
I'm not sure that students see themselves really as contributors, in that sense. I think they think if they are planning to be a writer or a journalist of something of that type, they're thinking way ahead. They're not thinking, even if I'm writing a paper now, I'm contributing to that scholarship and to that field, potentially, and even potentially in a big sense. It takes a while to get them to really see it that way.
yeah. All right. Zoom, anybody else? Like, I'm trying to check chat every once in a while too. So, all right, and this is the last big question that we have.
I think students increasingly, because universities recognize undergraduate research in particular as a really vital part of the transformational process that education entails these days, students enter into the scholarly conversation and into the community much earlier these days. And so an idea put forth during a summer research project with a faculty member can very much become part of the scholarly conversation, and therefore it puts the student into that role perhaps earlier than they might have expected to.
Right. So what about that? Students participating.
I think if we broaden, we're talking about conversation, and I use that metaphor for the academic sort of marketplace. A good conversation involves asking questions. And so some of my ideas have come from students who ask the question like, well, why is it that way? And if I can't explain it in terms that they'd understand, then maybe I need to understand it better myself. But that can also spur research questions. So it's it doesn't just have to be undergraduates asking that question of themselves and then doing the research to try to figure out the answer, but it's, some other, they can be our interlocutors where they ask a question that spurs our research.
If you're doing research or if you're having a student do research in a really technical field, it can take a very, very long time to get the student, to the point where they can contribute something. They're not going to get the necessary background information in their classes. Especially, if I'm trying to help get a student to do a research in polymer science, we don't have any polymer science courses here at the university, and so it's possible for an undergraduate student to make a contribution, but they really have to. It's a long-term commitment, basically, in a more technical field like that. I'm not even sure how it works in less technical fields, but I think it's just much more difficult to get students to the point where they can really enter the scholarly conversation, I guess, which is unfortunate because time is one thing that students don't have.
Right. Do you find your students, this is a little off topic, but do you find them coming to you with things that they've read like on Twitter or social media somewhere that like, oh, hey, is this true? Or just, could that really happen?
Well, it has. I'm not saying it. Well, actually, maybe it's happened quite a few times. I'm just thinking of one example where some kids from the school where I used to teach saw this video online of a guy inverting a glass of water with a cover on it, okay, so that the water didn't spill out. And then he, I guess he like spun the glass in some way, and when he lifted it off, the water was just staying piled up in the shape of the glass, okay, and then spilled onto the table, okay. Now, of course, he was a magician, okay. What he was telling people was, yeah, you know, if you do this trick in a certain way, you can get the water to just stand there in midair, okay? Because he wanted to basically laugh up his sleeve while thousands of people around the country were spilling water all over the place, trying to get it to stand up in a cone or whatever. So I may have had a little bit too much fun disillusioning them about that. But yeah, I get those kinds of questions every now and then.
I'm one of those people, I tend to click on the comments on things like that on Facebook and then just, or on Twitter, and I'm just like, and I'll laugh about some of them. And I always love, there's always a student that comes on there that, you know, I've asked Professor so-and-so at such and such university, which is very well regarded, and they said this. And I think of that like as a good example of students being able to sort of participate in the conversation about scholarship without necessarily being scholarly in the conversation. Yes. Yes, so getting students involved in research early seems as though a great way to mentor and to teach. I definitely agree. I think that, I mean, obviously, I'm not inside Dr. Tidwell's head, but I know some of the conversations we've had around the strategic planning that have to do with undergraduate research. I think that that might be one of the reasons why we want to have that conversation too.
Well, this is a good place to mention that we now have a faculty liaison, and we have a faculty learning community for student research, specifically for undergraduate research, as we are going to have some new grant opportunities for faculty to actually hire undergraduate students to do research. Those will come out this semester, and then those students will be able to be hired for the fall semester. But I'm just wondering, you know, if some of what you're talking about couldn't be addressed to the faculty learning community on student research. They have a meeting on Thursday this week at 1 o'clock here in the center, you know, and if someone was just to come and say, you know, hey, this is what we could do, because it is part of our strategic plan, and that's a group that's going to be, it's for all faculty. Anybody that wants to be part of that faculty learning community are welcome to come. They do a lyceum with the Honors College in the spring, and we'll co-sponsor that with the Honors College. But we really hope that we begin to get more students across the university, both undergraduate and graduate, involved in doing research and doing presentations and going to presentations with faculty. And so I think that's a really exciting opportunity that's coming for our faculty. But our students are going to need training. They're going to need help.
We'd be more than happy to help with that. That is definitely something that I think I'm looking at Rebecca's face going, yeah, let's do that. I think that's so important. Some of the things we have been talking about in this conversation made me think of, you know, having a step up on being a good writer. You were talking about students being able to communicate. When I was taking labs in undergrad for my science classes, my TA was like, oh, I wish everybody would write a lab report like yours. And I'm like, well, that's because I used to be a journalism major, you know? And so, you know, I think that what Julie was saying about being aware of and being exposed to those things definitely helps students understand and communicate a little better. I think when you read more scholarly stuff, your writing gets better with that, you know? If you're the type of person who reads novels, you're probably going to have a leg up on somebody who doesn't when it comes to just writing a paper, because it's second nature to think, oh, a period goes here, the sentence flow goes this way. And if you're communicating mostly in texting, that's not as natural. So I definitely think that's a great opportunity for our students. Cool to hear about that. All right. So that's what we had about the information has value section. Like I said, we have these brochures that have all of the frameworks on there and some of the questions that get asked and ways that you can see if students are crossing the information literacy thresholds. That if you're interested in hearing more about those with the other concepts, we're happy to talk about those. We do want to point out that we have our library liaisons. Each of the areas that we have majors in has a liaison assigned to it. So I have us on here. So Alma is our Director of Public Services, and she is our liaison for philosophy and religion, and she's also to honors and GATE. Vicki Betts is our history guru extraordinaire, but she is also with anthropology, communication, criminal justice, education, geography, and political science. Vandy Debris is art, children's literature, languages, literature, music, and theater. Sarah Norell is our business librarian. She does economics, HRD, psychology, public administration, and sociology. Suzanne Abbey is actually out on maternity leave right now, but she is our nursing liaison and does health sciences and kinesiology. In her absence, I'm kind of a contact person for that, although I am not the only person working to cover. And then there's me, yours truly. I'm biology, chemistry, computer science, engineering, industrial tech, math, and physics. And Rebecca, who is also here with me, who is our pharmacy liaison. So we are always really happy to work with our faculty to help in any way that we can, whether it's helping the students navigate the databases or library resources, trying to map some of these concepts to your curriculum. We also, on the back here, have a little list of what does your liaison librarian do. So we're the people who do collection development. If you have books or resources that you would like for us to purchase and have access to for your students, we are the people who do that. That information has value, that's us. We also help with reference assistance, so research assistance with your students, provide information literacy training. We also weed the collection, so if you find that there are things that are really out of date that your students are somehow coming across, then we definitely want to update those things. So let's be partners. We are happy to partner with all of our departments. All of our liaison librarians are on board with this and are really excited about it. So anytime that we can help you help ease some of your burden of getting these concepts across to your students, we definitely want to help. So.
Can I plug?
Yes, please do.
The resources that Vandy Dubry and Emily Standridge helped come up with. It's targeted towards the first 2 semesters of freshman comp, but I used some of the modules with my graduate courses last semester, and I just made a note. I need to do that for the graduate course this semester. It's a refresher in case they've been away for a while about scholarly versus popular sources. And so I think it's pitched for any level of audience. It's not just for 18, 19-year-olds. And I think they're, you embed a link and there's a quiz at the end. And I hope it helped. my students last semester did a pretty good job of research. So I'm definitely going to use some of those again.
Vandy is very embedded in the arts classes and is actually a faculty member of a couple of the classes.
Yeah, our research and photography course.
Right. And Vicki is very embedded in history and actually sits in on the interviews with the new history professors because she's a published historian. Unfortunately, she is retired this year. So this is going to be an incredible loss.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say that because I keep hoping she'll change her mind.
And all of this work to try to be as embedded as possible in all of our, but it has to be the faculty allowing us and inviting us in, because that's the way it works. Best.
Does anybody have any questions about the frameworks or these threshold concepts that we've been talking about, or anything else that we've been talking about? I mean, I'm not going to limit. Well, I think we got finished a little faster, so yay, yes.
Right.
Mhm. So thank you so much for joining us today and allowing us to be part of this conversation with you. I hope that we can partner in the future. If you have any questions that come up, please don't hesitate to contact me or Rebecca. We'd be happy to sit down and talk to you. I see some chat coming in. So, and for those of you who joined us by Zoom, I'm going to make sure I get a list from Nicole so that we can send you the handouts and the booklet that we had, so that you have that to review as well.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
so
very
much.
much.